In 1917, the First World War raged in Europe. A bloody stalemate meant that war would continue for years, and by the end of the fighting, over 13 million would lose their life. In Russia, they had problems of their own. Years of feudal society had created a huge gap between the peasants of the Russian agricultural villages and the rich and powerful gentry of the Tsarist cities. The country had missed out on what the Industrial Revolution had to offer, and soon sought for a revolution of their own. The workers cut off the food supply to the cities, and with casualties of 9 million, the people would refuse to fight for a king that they wouldn't support. Ben Derpy, historian, writes that the Tsarist regime handled the war with particular ineptness, causing suffering on an unimaginable scale. On February 15th, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, and the people of Russia revolted, murdering the whole royal family, apart from one, Grand Duchess Anastasia.
Heart, don't fail me now. Courage, don't desert me.
A provincial government and a fairly liberal government was set up and headed by Georgy Leov. However, Vladimir Lenin, a Marxist who was exiled to Siberia for sedition, returned to St. Petersburg after hearing the news of the February Revolution. He led the Bolshevik Party in the October Revolution, and the Soviets stormed the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, causing chaos on the streets. Lenin seized power, thus ending the parliamentary Russia and setting up the world's first constitutionalized socialist state. In the middle of this chaos, violence and bloodshed, there stood two beautiful theatres, the Mariinsky Theatre of St. Petersburg and the Bolshoi Theatre of Moscow. Inside these theatres, beautiful ballerinas danced on the stages. Traditionally, the imperial theatres were under royal patronage. Christina Ezrahi described the Mariinsky Theatre as central in the social life of imperial St. Petersburg. She then goes on to ask, could the artistry of the imperial ballet survive and develop after a revolution that destroyed the social and political order of which ballet had formed an intrinsic part? The short answer is yes. It would survive and it would develop. But immediately after the revolution, Russian ballet was in serious trouble. It would fight a long battle before it would regain its previous prestige. Fedor Lopukov, dancer, choreographer, and during the years 1922 to 1927 artistic director of the Mariinsky, is quoted in Azari's work Swans of the Kremlin. He says,
The company seriously contracted, some grew seriously ill, some died, others left Petrograd in fertile searches for a quiet haven. Panic, terror, tormented the artists of the former imperial theatres.
This quote from a strong source illustrates the seriousness of the situation. The Mariinsky membership had dropped by 40% by the seasons 1918 to 1919. The royal patronage was, of course, gone, and the ballet theatre, which in very nature glorified the old regime with its stories of princes and princesses, grand palaces and magical stories, was having its very existence questioned in terms of its cultural significance. The defendant of ballet became Anatoly Lunacharsky, a fellow revolutionary and friend of Lenin. He is described as an intelligent and cultured man. Lenin himself once said of Lunacharsky,
I advise you to be fond of him. He is drawn to the future with his whole being. He is ready to give joy and laughter to everyone.
Lunacharsky was the People's Commissar for Enlightenment, which covered the former Ministry of Imperial Education and State Education Committee created by the provincial government, and the former Palace Ministry, which controlled imperial theatres and the Academy of Arts. Ballet was under his sphere of political influence, and he is widely acknowledged as the man who saved ballet and stopped it becoming a forgotten symbol of the old imperial regime. At the 8th Congress of the Russian Party of Bolsheviks, held on March 18, 1919, the Statement of Enlightenment announced plans to give free theatre tickets to the workers. At the Mariinsky, 9 opera and ballet performances were given for free trade unions in the 1918 to 1919 season, and 86 in the 1920 to 1921 season. In November 1921, workers of Petrograd received 21,110 seats for 38 performances at the former Mariinsky. In Moscow, 577,434 tickets for the Bolshoi and its smaller branch stage, the Filial, were distributed in the 1919-1920 seasons, amounting to 84.5% of the full house. In the 1920 to 1921 seasons, 303,218 tickets for the Bolshoi were distributed, amounting to 96.8% of the full house. This new scheme was very successful in getting the proletariat public interested in ballet. It also meant that dancers had an audience and at least kept the activity going in the theatre. Also, it wouldn't help the theatre's near economic depletion. Another policy that Lunacharsky would defend is that the classical ballets would be kept in the repertoire. This was a crucial decision, as it meant that they would be remembered and re-choreographed back onto the former imperial stages of the Mariinsky and the Bolshoi. This wasn't an easy task, but it meant that at a high political level, ballet was being defended. Elizabeth Saueritz, ballet critic and historian, writes, "The question of the future existence of ballet was decided when those governing the arts proclaimed that one of the basic principles of their policy was that they intended to save the classical heritage and to make it the legacy of future generations." She continues to say, "Considerable efforts were made on the part of the ballet workers. They were devoted to this goal, particularly during the first 5 years after the Revolution." Here it is easy to understand that Lunacharsky's decisive policy-making was defending ballet from collapse. The free ticket scheme and the repertoire preservation scheme are just two that highlight his personal significance in ballet's fight for survival. To finish this presentation, I will leave you with the words spoken by Anatoly Lunacharsky himself. I believe these words neatly summarize Lunacharsky's artistic principles, and thus conclude why ballet was saved from a violent revolution that, in theory, was against all that Imperial Russia stood for, including ballet. This speech was given at the Bolshoi Theatre of Moscow, 25th of April, 1921.
We need the old art not only because it is valuable in itself, it is pleasing and aesthetically perfect. We need it because from this lamp, new candles are lightened. Due to the special social conditions of which I will not speak now, Russia particularly was able in the field of ballet art to create marvelous traditions, to reach a degree of mastery unattained by any other country in any field of the theatre. All this clear, strict mastery, these possessions of all the secrets of the noble art, gives full freedom of the body and grace to loosely spread, to allow it to be suppressed before it can be used for the new artist, cultured public. This would be a great misfortune, a great crime. Is it needed of not? Maybe ballet might be abolished in Russia. Never! Long live the comrades, the worst of the people. Long live art! Yeah!